For LBC, I'm Tim Daly.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Four minutes past 8 on LBC. You can watch us on Global Player for the next 2 hours. With me in this hour is Simon Marks for our second question marks, or is it question marks? I think the jury's out on that one. Do you want to decide, Simon?
I think we could come down somewhere in the middle, couldn't we?
Probably not. Now, for those of you who don't know him, I don't know how you can not know him, but Simon is our US correspondent. And obviously this is a big year, not just in British politics, but in American politics too. And I guess over the next few months, Simon's voice is going to be even more regular on this station than it has been in the last few months. So he's here to answer your questions on the presidential election. Essentially, the primaries have they finished? I mean,
no, they're still happening.
They're still happening.
I mean, we're not paying any attention to them because, the results are clear. We know who the candidates are going to be. But the process has to take place because you've got to have those delegates handed over to Biden, pledged to Biden or to Trump, so that the convention, the Republican convention in Milwaukee and then the Democratic Party's convention in Chicago, can actually occur so that they can officially become the respective presidential candidates. So the process continues.
And if you've got any questions on the process of the presidential election or the policies or anything you like, Simon is here until 9 o'clock. But I want to start off with the big news of the day. That's the death of O.J. Simpson. You covered that trial back in the day. Was it 1995?
1995 for this very radio station.
We have unearthed a clip of Simon Marks from the 13th of February 1995.
From the outset, the trial of O.J. Simpson has often seemed more like a circus than a legal proceeding, and yesterday it succeeded in slipping from the sublime to the ridiculous. A field trip was laid on for jurors to familiarise themselves with the key locations in the case against the football star, locations which have already become top tourist attractions in Los Angeles in the light of their notoriety. The field trip itself took remarkable preparation. In what were his first moments outside jail since his arrest, he wore a special security belt that would deliver an electric shock if he tried to escape. He did not, nor did any members of the jury. O.J. Simpson returned to prison. The men and women who will eventually decide his fate checked back into their hotel. The trial resumes in the courtroom again tomorrow.
So posh.
It was earlier in my career. I've mellowed.
How do you think that the death of O.J. Simpson is being covered in America? Because there are still people who regard him as a slightly heroic figure.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I think a very divisive figure in America, and indeed the trial was ultimately very divisive because even though the vast majority of people thought that O.J. Simpson had done it and was getting away with double murder, there was still a pretty sizable community, particularly of African Americans, who viewed this trial through a racial prism. So I think that it is going to be reflected in today's memorials that will be the coverage that's taking place on American television and in all the newspapers and on the websites and the discussion that's taking place on social media. I mean, you could hear there that here on LBC and on the British media, we were all covering this trial wall to wall. It was an absolutely pivotal moment for the United States because in many ways it was the point at which things in America, I think, almost inexorably shifted and changed. Because when he was first arrested, particularly the international audience, they didn't really have a connection with O.J. Simpson unless you were one of the few at the time American football fans in the United Kingdom. You didn't really know who he was. You might have seen him act in a film, but there was no obvious cultural connection for people in this country with the man who was accused of this double murder. And yet, as this became the cable news sensation that it was, and it was really CNN, because at that point they were the only game in 24-hour cable news, as it became that cable news sensation, so all the other news channels internationally started hooking into it. And I mean, we covered the verdict live at 6 o'clock in the evening, the night that it came down. 6 o'clock in the evening here, 1 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern time. I was on air with then Peter Dealey, who was in the chair here. Great Peter Dealey. And then my brother was actually reminding me today that subsequent to doing that live broadcast, we stayed on air for hours, open-ended, doing more and more coverage of this trial. And sort of counterintuitive in a way, why on earth was Britain so fascinated by the trial? And then, you can see tonight on the news channels here this evening, wall-to-wall coverage of his death. Very controversial figure who will be remembered in those terms. And there will, of course, be millions and millions of people who think he got away with the murder of his ex-wife and Ron Goldman, the waiter in that restaurant.
And I'm one of them. I mean, I wasn't there, I wasn't in the trial, but we've all formed our views over time. But anyway, let's move on to what we're really here to talk about, and that is the presidential election. Only, May, June, July, August, September, so 6 months to go.
Only 6 months to go. It's an edge of the seater already. Can you believe it?
Is it?
An edge of the seater. I think it is a bit of an edge of the seater. I mean, and I suspect that by the time we're into the last 3 weeks, it really will be an edge of the seater. I mean, when we did this last time, a couple of months ago, Donald Trump was further ahead of Joe Biden than he is now. Joe Biden has clawed back some of Donald Trump's advantage in some of those critical battleground states where the election will ultimately be won or lost. And he's done it because he's been able to spend $30 million on an advertising and organizational blitz in 7 of those states. And in one of them, Wisconsin, which is going to be an important state under any circumstances in November, he has erased Donald Trump's lead and is slightly ahead of him. In the other 6, he's still trailing, but in many of them not by the distance that he was trailing a couple of months ago. So while Democrats are certainly not exhaling, they're still holding their breath. But while they're holding their breath, they are daring to dream that if he can carry on pouring money into these battleground states, he can slowly chisel away and erase Donald Trump's advantage. The flip side to that coin is Joe Biden has already spent $30 million in the battleground states, and it is only April. And if that didn't overturn Donald Trump's lead in the other 6, what more does he have to do? I mean, he's going to have to throw the kitchen sink at it to try and make the deal. So I think I think the outcome remains uncertain, but it would be a brave man at the moment who bet against Donald Trump.
Well, just to get you in the mood for this hour, Matt says, please tell Simon that my mum just said he looks just as handsome as his voice.
Well, that
number of
depends on the
comments
voice.
spring to my mind.
And also it depends on which voice, this one or the old one.
Yeah, I'm not going to go there. We've got lots of texts coming in, lots of calls as well. 0345 6060 973. Mark says, always look forward to hearing Simon. My question is, does he think that in view of the recent abortion decision, Joe Biden has been given a lifeline which may help him get over the line against Trump, assuming they will both be the candidates in November?
Well, Mark, it is an excellent question because, of course, the Democrats would love this to be essentially a single issue election. I mean, they'd like it to be a double issue election. Number 1, the economy, and number 2, abortion. But they see in the abortion issue an opportunity to mobilise their grassroots voters and to get people to turn out at the polls who otherwise might not be terribly excited and enthused about putting Joe Biden back into the White House. The decision that I think Mark is referring to is this decision by the Arizona Supreme Court to uphold an effort to reapply a law from 1864 that would outlaw abortion completely in the state. And it's created division within the Republican Party because, of course, Donald Trump is saying, well, hang on a second, this should be a decision for legislatures to decide, not necessarily Supreme Courts. He has come out against the concept of a national restriction on abortion. We know that they're also
But is he on strong ground on that?
Well, no, he's on very wobbly ground on that. That's why I think Mark is pointing at a possible opportunity for the Democrats to cut through, because he's been immediately assailed by people further to the right of him on this particular issue who say, no, we absolutely have to push through and do whatever we can to restrict and ban abortion in as many states as possible by whatever means. So Donald Trump is trying to thread the needle and find a way of keeping everybody on side, and that's very, very difficult for him to do. Democrats are hoping that they can use this to push Joe Biden towards victory. We're going to see Democrats now mobilizing very heavily in Florida as well, where abortion is going to be on the ballot this November after another court decision a few days ago. Democrats had almost given up on Florida. Now suddenly there's reason to flood people to the state to try and ensure that abortion rights protections are enshrined in Florida law. So this is going to be one of the major issues that Democrats use absolutely to try and propel Joe Biden to victory. The problem is there are all sorts of other issues that are likely possibly to dominate this campaign, especially if the Republicans have their way and keep the focus, as they have done, on illegal immigration.
How's the Israel-Gaza conflict playing in American politics?
Well, it's absolutely catastrophic for Joe Biden. And the longer it goes on, the worse it becomes for Joe Biden. And that's partly because of his handling of it. I mean, let's be honest, the man who projects himself as the foreign policy expert, the indispensable figure because of the decades of experience that he's got as the former chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, has found himself boxed into a very uncomfortable corner, or rather he's boxed himself into it through his determination not publicly to go as far as some of his fellow Democrats in breaking with Benjamin Netanyahu. So Arab American voters, particularly in Michigan, an absolutely crucial battleground state this November, have deserted him in droves. Progressives on the left of the party...
But when you say deserted him in droves, where are they going to go?
They'll stay home.
So they just won't vote?
Some of them might consider flipping their votes, but they'll stay home. And here's the thing. Turnout in November, both of these candidates, Biden and Trump, have to get everybody to the polls. This is one of the reasons why Biden is engaging now in this organizational campaign in the battleground states, building offices, hiring hundreds of staff, because it's all about launching and mounting a successful get-out-the-vote campaign. And the coalition that put Biden into the White House, which included Arab American voters, young voters, progressive left-wing Democrats who are all absolutely furious over what they argue is Biden's complicity with Netanyahu's military assault on Gaza, are deserting him. But if Biden tacks too far and breaks with Netanyahu, he runs the risk of alienating Jewish American voters in some key states. For Joe Biden, this is becoming a very miserable experience. Everywhere he goes, he is pursued by people calling him chants of Genocide Joe. He had that huge fundraiser at Radio City Music Hall with Barack Obama and Bill Clinton a few days ago in New York. The people arriving at that event had to run the gauntlet of protesters, and then they had to run the gauntlet of protesters when they left. And the longer this continues with no end in sight, and no clear American policy for resolving it, the worse his predicament becomes. Donald Trump, by the way, is not having a completely free ride on this, because he actually has been quite critical of Netanyahu. Their personal relationship is not what it used to be. He accuses Netanyahu of betraying him because he congratulated Joe Biden on the election win back in 2020. So Donald Trump is in a predicament, but nowhere near as sticky a predicament as President Biden finds himself.
We'll come to your calls in a moment to Simon Marks. It's 17 minutes past 8.
LBC Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
90 minutes past 8. It's question marks on LBC with our very own Simon Marks. Let's go to Sean in Preston. Hello, Sean.
Good evening, gentlemen.
Hi.
Evening, Sean.
Could there be another insurgency on the capital if Trump loses?
Well, I think the answer to that question is yes. I mean, I think that there are grave fears of what will happen if Trump loses and once again insists that the election has been rigged against him. I mean, he, as you know, Sean, has completely seeded the clouds in that regard by relentlessly saying since the outcome of the 2020 election that America's electoral integrity is absolutely under question. And he has at times indicated that he will expect his supporters to back him very clearly. Now, there was a reference that Donald Trump made at a recent rally that his supporters say was taken out of context when he said that if he lost the election, there was going to be a bloodbath in the United States. And I think in terms of the context, it is important to understand that he was making a speech, he was having difficulty with the teleprompter, he started putting the prepared text to one side, he engaged in a riff, he was talking about the tariffs that he says he will impose on Chinese manufactured electric vehicles that are assembled in Mexico and transported into the United States. And then he said, but that's the least of it. If I lose this election, there's going to be a bloodbath. Now, his supporters say that he was referencing a bloodbath that was going to play itself out in the automotive industry. It's not entirely clear that that's the case, but
to be fair, it was. If you listen to his comments afterwards, it was, because I fell for that one as well and retweeted something which, I mean, it was totally wrong. And I had to backtrack when I heard what he said afterwards.
Yes, but it wasn't immediately clear that you could see the connective tissue between talking about these tariffs and then talking about a bloodbath. But he has, on other occasions, encouraged his supporters to get ready to defend American democracy. He's always addressing them as patriots. That's the word that he uses to describe them. And there's no question that, you know, the man is vowing on his first day in office to consider pardoning those people who have been found guilty and jailed for their involvement in the uprising on January the 6th. I think there will be grave anxiety about the outcome if the outcome of the election is Donald Trump losing and then claiming that he actually won again.
Of course, the last time this happened, you were in your garage, I was in my bedroom, and we were doing live commentary for 4 hours on it.
Absolutely.
It was great fun, but I'm slightly horrified.
It was a day, frankly, that I just never thought I would see in the United States. There was one previous example of that as well. If you recall, at one point, Donald Trump, when he made that successful walk out of the White House, flanked by members of his staff, and went over to St. John's Church near the White House, clutching the Bible. And there were protesters on the streets outside the White House, and the police moved in to clear them out before Trump emerged from the White House. And there was a really tense moment where protesters were on their knees, refusing to move as police started moving in. And I was actually live on the air with Tom during that. And it, for a moment, looked like things were going to get extremely nasty, again, in a way that one simply never imagined that you'd see on the streets of Washington, D.C.
Neil says, where is Trump's wife? She seems rather absent.
Well, she's not as absent. I mean, she's not fully engaged in the campaign. It is fair to say that, Neil, and the Trump team and the former president himself say that she will become more engaged as time advances. But she has been at his side. She was at his side at a massive fundraiser that they held at Mar-a-Lago a couple of weeks ago. I think it's also important to underscore that she is grieving. Her mother passed away a few weeks ago, and obviously the entire family went into a process of mourning and attending the funeral, which was held in New York City. So she's certainly not at his side when he makes court appearances. And one of the questions next week, when that first trial, we think, gets underway in New York, the hush money payments that were allegedly made to Stormy Daniels in the dying days of the 2016 election campaign, I don't think she'll be anywhere near her husband for the potential 6 weeks of that legal proceeding. But she hasn't completely disappeared. And when it matters, the Hungarian leader, Viktor Orban, was a guest at Mar-a-Lago 2 or 3 weeks ago. She was by his side for that, absolutely. When it matters, she's there for him.
Well, you may have questions about Donald Trump's various court appearances over the next few months and what the implications of that might be. The number 0345 6060 973. Michael says, a question for Simon. Joe Biden is now resorting to making predictions of Fed rate cuts in September. He did this in the presser with the Japanese PM this week in a desperate attempt to put political pressure on the Fed to make a decision against its dual mandate. Why is Biden not being criticised as much as Trump was for doing this?
I think it's a very fair question, Michael. I mean, they've clearly been knocked back this week by the fact that the inflation rate came in slightly higher than anyone was expecting, which has once again led the Fed, I think, to conclude that it is too early to ease off on these interest rates. And potentially for Joe Biden, that is a bit of an electoral disaster. So I think that is an expression by the President of the United States of frustration more than anything else. But it also goes to the heart of a problem that he's got connecting with voters. And his own former chief of staff, Ron Klain, had some very salty language that was revealed by the website Politico just yesterday on this, saying that the Biden campaign is failing to connect with voters and make the argument that the economy is as strong as Joe Biden actually claims that it is. The specific criticism by Ron Klain is that Joe Biden is spending too much time opening repaired bridges as a result of his infrastructure funding that he managed to steer through Congress, and not spending enough time talking to Americans about interest rates, the price of eggs, the price of milk, the pocketbook issues that Americans will use to determine if they're going to back him again for 4 more years. But the question is a perfectly reasonable one. And yes, he is, like presidents in the past, trying to put pressure on the Fed chair, in this case Jerome Powell, to get those interest rates lowered in time for the election.
Paul in Bournemouth says, will high US interest rates cause Biden to lose the November election? And we all remember James Carville saying about one of the Clinton elections, it's the economy, stupid. The first one, I think. And the economy is, in a sense, far more important in US elections than maybe it is here.
Yeah,
Would you agree with that?
I think that's I think the economy is the central issue. And one of the difficulties is that while job creation is moving at a pace much faster than even the most optimistic analysts anticipated, the jobs that are being created are not necessarily highly paid jobs. And again, Americans sitting at home, going to the grocery store, taking their family out to a meal in a restaurant, looking at the value of their retirement accounts, although those have recovered to some degree over the last 6 months or so, just are not feeling the buoyancy of the economy that Joe Biden and his backers insists is actually taking place. And they've got to find a way of connecting with the average American voter if they're truly going to prove to voters that you are better off than you were 4 years ago.
Because that is often the key to an American president being re-elected for a second term. It was with Reagan in 84. It was with Clinton in 96. I mean, Bush and Obama, you probably know better than me.
If you're not better off than you were 4 years ago, you are less minded to give the guy another 4 years. I mean, that's just the reality in a country where it's all about constantly building prosperity and improving your own personal lot in life. And Donald Trump some will say that he completely over-eggs the argument and exaggerates the case, but he will say, well, hang on a second. I mean, my stewardship of the economy, by contrast, wasn't that catastrophic, and it's Joe Biden who's wrecked everything. Give me a chance to get back in there and I'll put things back together and rebuild. I'll make America great again.
I think someone's texting the wrong person here. David Hull says, have you got your getaway arranged? I don't know who that's directed at, but hopefully not one of us.
Well, it's an interesting question, David, because, as Ian knows, because we were discussing it a little bit earlier today, there are lots of people, particularly in Washington, D.C. and New York and up and down the East Coast, who are having that conversation. I mean, the Plan B conversation, what are we going to do if, is a real conversation that people are having, and some people are much more seriously, I think, talking this time about leaving than they were last time. Last time round, people said, well, if Trump wins, I'm moving to Canada. Well, people didn't move to Canada when Donald Trump won. I think this time round you might see some people deciding to up sticks and shelter somewhere while they wait and see exactly what happens.
Well, you better not do that, otherwise we'd be...
Where would you be?
Dead
I know,
struck,
terrible
we?
trouble.
Anyway, while we all contemplate that eventuality, let's go to the news headlines at 8:30 with Tim Daly.
The former American football star O.J. Simpson, who was cleared of murdering his ex-wife and a friend in the 1990s, has died of cancer. He was 76 years old. Israel says it will retaliate with force if it's attacked by Iran. There are concerns Tehran is planning a revenge strike after its consulate in Damascus was bombed last Monday. And a 19-year-old man has been arrested on suspicion of murder after the death of a man in his 50s in North London. It's thought Mark Carroll was stabbed in Camden on Wednesday. LBC weather, rain moving in from the southwest overnight, which will also go into the south of Scotland, staying mostly dry though in the south and the east of the UK, with an overnight low of 8 degrees.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:32, Simon Marks is here taking your questions about the US presidential election. Interesting text here from Graham in Bush. Sorry, it's an email from Graham in Bushy. Who is a better president for Israel, Biden or Trump?
Well, Graham, I think that depends a bit on what you mean by Israel. If you mean who is a better president for Benjamin Netanyahu, it's probably going to end up being Donald Trump, because I think Joe Biden is increasingly close to breaking with the current Israeli prime minister. But if you mean Israel and its existence as a nation state, I think the Democrats would argue that one of the reasons why Joe Biden is hesitant to do what so many of his supporters would like him to do and break with Benjamin Netanyahu is that he genuinely believes that the existence of the State of Israel has the potential very soon to be on the line, especially if Israel comes under relentless assault from Hezbollah in the north and from the Iranians. And insiders at the White House say Joe Biden is trying to keep some of his powder dry because he doesn't know how much of it he's going to need in the event that that broader assault takes place. So the Democrats would argue it's Joe Biden. The Republicans would say, well, hang on a second. Donald Trump is the president who negotiated the Abraham Accords, particularly through his son-in-law Jared Kushner, who held that signing ceremony, beginning the groundwork for a process that was poised, certainly right up until October the 7th and the murderous assault by Hamas on Israel, to see a normalization in the relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia. They argue that it's Donald Trump who can put that back on track because he has the track record of having brought the Abraham Accords across the line. But I think in broad foreign policy terms, if you want to know whose government is most likely to be filled with experts, seasoned veterans of the Middle East process, with an understanding of the nuances of what's taking place, you would probably argue that Joe Biden is a safer pair of hands than Donald Trump, because Donald Trump has been absolutely explicit that his administration is not going to be hiring any experts unless they're dyed-in-the-wool Make America Great Again supporters. And that's not just on the foreign policy playing field, it is across the board.
What are the rumours about him having offered Nigel Farage a job of some description?
Well, Donald Trump and Nigel Farage, as we know, have a friendship. Nigel Farage has spent a lot of time with Donald Trump, both when he was president of the United States and in the years that he has been charting his political comeback. I remember driving to work one morning, I think, and I thought I knew what story I was going to be covering that morning, and I glanced at my telephone halfway to the office and saw that Donald Trump was proposing that Nigel Farage should be the next British ambassador to the United States, and suddenly all the cards were thrown up into the air. So there's no doubt that the two of them have a relationship and a friendship and a political proximity. Would Donald Trump give Nigel Farage a position in his government, in a cabinet level post? I mean, it's not impossible. And again, it's not impossible. It's possible because Donald Trump wants to surround himself with people who believe in his mission. He thinks, with some justification, that the reason everything went wrong for him in the first term was because he made too much room for too many people that disagreed with him. And if you look at, whether it was the former White House Chief of Staff General John Kelly or the former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who was foisted on him by Condoleezza Rice, or James Comey, the director of the FBI, all of these people with whom he ultimately fell out and that he views as traitors at this point, he believes that it was that insistence by Republicans writ large that, you must build a big tent and you must bring all of these people in because they're experts, that proved to be a sticking point for him. And Steve Bannon and the other figures that are surrounding him and that are really charting this campaign say that what you need to do is you need to fire every single civil servant. And they're talking about firing tens and tens of thousands of civil servants and replacing them only with dyed-in-the-wool Make America Great Again loyalists. And there's nothing to stop them from doing that if that is truly the government that Donald Trump wants to form. And you could imagine a set of circumstances in which Nigel Farage and potentially some other figures from other countries could find themselves serving in that government.
Martin's in Guildford. Hi, Martin.
Hi. My question is, I've just been reading a book by Molly Hemingway called Rigged. And this says that the count in the various swing states were stopped in the middle of the night. So my question is, why were the counts stopped? And why in those states did it take days for the votes to be actually finalised?
Well, I will tell you, Martin, that I have not read that Molly Hemingway book yet, but I know that it is a favourite of Donald Trump and his supporters. I think, and I'm not sure what specific instances she's relating or what specific state Go ahead.
Well, I was watching the election on my laptop in the night, and very simultaneously, those various states did stop the count. So my question to you is, why were the counts stopped?
Well, I can't tell you specifically why those counts would have been stopped, but I can tell you that every single state in the country has its own election laws and makes its own election policies, and it is perfectly...
There's nothing in the laws that says that the count should stop.
I don't know the answer to that question. There may be in some states a decision that is made to stop the count and resume it in the morning. I mean, I think that happens as a matter of course in many American states, and it's happened in many American elections. But look,
what do you say about Georgia? What was the reason given for
the Georgia case and the other cases have all been relentlessly examined by a vast array of different...
Hang on. Why was the count stopped in Georgia? What was the reason given?
I have no idea. I have no idea. I'm not an expert on Georgia election law, and I can't tell you precisely why it was stopped. It is to do with the election law. It is to do with the election law in those states because each state runs its own elections. And look, every single investigation that has taken place into the allegations of a coordinated effort to defraud the American public of the right and justified outcome of the 2020 presidential election has not only failed to come up with clear evidence of any kind of conspiracy, but Donald Trump's own lawyers in more than 60 courts all over the country made absolutely no headway whatsoever, even in jurisdictions where they were coming up against judges that were appointed by Donald Trump, in advancing the argument that election fraud took place in 2020.
In those 60 cases, how many cases went to evidence? What was evidence heard?
Well, they don't. I don't know the number, but they would only go to evidentiary hearings if the judges had found in procedural hearings that there was any evidence that was being presented by Donald Trump's lawyers and by his legal team to advance the case that there had been electoral fraud. Those judges all decided that there was no evidence to hear.
So you're admitting that in those 60 cases, no evidence, no witnesses were actually called?
It's not a question of admission. It is a fact that in those cases, in the vast majority of those cases, the judges determined that Trump's lawyers had presented no kind of case that justified evidentiary examination. And the bar for doing that is relatively low. They were thrown out of courtroom after courtroom after courtroom. And at some stage, one would have expected them to make some headway in some of those cases. Let's also not forget that figures like Rudy Giuliani, the president's former lawyer, have not only been disbarred from practicing law in a variety of different jurisdictions, but he is facing financial ruin because of the defamation lawsuits that have been brought against him. Because of the defamation lawsuits that have been brought against him for the completely unproven and untrue conspiracy theories that he spread about the activities of election workers in Georgia. So
I agree with you. And what was the award against Rudy Giuliani?
I forget the size of the award, but it was a massive
million.
No, the $540 million is the award against the Trump organization in...
No, was it about $100 million?
I forget the number. I forget. It was a substantial financial award.
Could it have been something in that region?
It was $148 million.
There we go.
Yes. Do you think that is a fair figure for that defamation?
Well, it's not. I wasn't sitting in the courtroom and listening to the evidence. He will appeal. An appeals court will make the determination as to whether it was a fair award. We've seen appeals courts reverse awards and reduce the size of those awards. We may actually see an appeals court reduce the size of the award that the Trump organization is being expected to pay in the fraud lawsuit in New York. It's perfectly possible that number will be reduced.
Well, that put you through your paces, didn't it? Martin, thank you. Let's go to Stuart in Ruislip. Hello, Stuart.
Good evening.
Evening.
Trump is usurping the American legal system to delay going into court. Do you think the court results will affect the election?
Well, I don't think he is usurping the American legal system. I think that he is very, very effectively using every tool at his disposal to do whatever he can to delay and obfuscate and run out the clock on these cases to get to November. And Democrats are absolutely furious about this and, in fact, are pointing the finger of blame at various judges, at the Attorney General Merrick Garland and others. But at the end of the day, Donald Trump has the right that every American citizen has. And, you know, clearly he is wealthier than most American citizens and can afford legal representation that allows him to do this. But he has the right to...
He spent $100 million on legal fees, and not 1 cent of it is his money.
Well, I suspect he hasn't spent $100 million because he has a track record of not always paying his legal bills. So I think there might be an open question about that. But the reality is he has the right to do what he is doing. And if you look at the prosecutions that he faces, I mean, we're talking about 4 cases in 4 jurisdictions. The one that begins next week is largely considered the runt of the criminal cases against him. It's the case relating to the hush money payment to Stormy Daniels. Looks like that trial's going to get underway on April the 15th. Highly unlikely that he would face a custodial sentence if he was convicted, but certainly he will make history should he be convicted in becoming the first sitting or former American president ever to be convicted of a criminal count. The Georgia case against him is falling to pieces because of the extraordinary decision by the district attorney in Fulton County, Fannie Willis, to hire a prosecutor with whom she was having an affair. And that has completely, for the moment, derailed that case and kicked it into the long grass. And Donald Trump, I think, would be mad not to have launched that appeal and to say, I actually don't think that this should be going ahead in the fashion in which it's going ahead. The federal case against him in Washington, D.C. for election interference, I suspect is also going to end up being delayed and may not begin before the November election. And there is grave disquiet down in Florida where the special prosecutor who's bringing the case against Donald Trump for the alleged mishandling of classified documents is knocking up against a Trump-appointed lawyer in federal court there who has, the prosecutor argues, been dragging her feet in terms of getting that trial going. So it may well be that the only one of these cases that actually gets heard before the election is the Stormy Daniels case. And while I know people, Democrats particularly, are frustrated that Donald Trump is able to obfuscate, delay, and try and kick all of this into the long grass, he's got the right to do it. And it's not a surprise to me that he's doing it.
That then raises the possibility that while he's president, these cases will happen, and he could be, if he's found guilty, he could be jailed as president.
Well, it's absolutely clear that the 2 federal cases, if he's president, will fall away completely because he will strip the Department of Justice, he's been open about this, of its traditional independence, not constitutionally guaranteed independence. So he can strip it of its independence and he can order...
Well, Joe Biden's already done that in the last 24 hours, hasn't he? About Julian Assange.
Well, I think that's a really good point, Ian. I mean, this notion that Joe Biden says that the Department of Justice is completely independent and he's not put a thumb on the scale in terms of the cases against Donald Trump. But then he comes out and says, well, actually, we're considering dropping these charges against Julian Assange, is an extraordinary position for Joe Biden to take in the middle of this conversation with Donald Trump. But I think in terms of these criminal cases that he faces, they can be increasingly confident within the Trump campaign that not much happens before the election. After the election, the 2 federal cases go away if he wins. The Georgia case looks like it's going to either be just so woefully delayed, but it may just collapse under its own weight. And he's not going to be jailed over paying some money to an adult film actress. That's just not going to happen. Just remember, even were he to be convicted in these 4 cases and re-elected, he can pardon himself, we think, on the 2 federal charges. He could not pardon himself in New York and Georgia. So the one they're really worried about is Georgia. And they'll be delighted that that's collapsing under its own weight.
Somebody sent a really lovely text here. Mr. Dale, you can call me Ian if you like. Just caught up with last night's show. What a delightful 3 hours, especially that last hour. Your guest, the Imam, was a delight and a fascinating person and deserved all the positive calls and feedback. Well done. P.S. I still love it when you have a tantrum. I'm unlikely to have a tantrum tonight, but we'll see what
Did you have a tantrum last night?
I don't think... Did I have a tantrum last night? I think I did the night before.
Really?
Oh. I usually do when I get a racist call up, because they deserve it. It's 8:48.
LBC. Iain Dale. Text 84850. This is LBC.
It's 8:51 on LBC. Coming up after 9, we have Ian Aitchison with us in the studio. He's the author of a book called Screwed, Britain's Prison Crisis and How to Escape It. It's a fascinating book. He knows all about the prison service. You'll have your views on how to reform it, and we'll be taking your calls with Ian Aitchison after 9. He's former prison governor who later led an independent review into extremism inside prisons, and he's now a senior advisor to the Counter-Extremism Project. And as I say, this book is called Screwed, Britain's Prison Crisis and How to Escape It. At least we haven't got the same crisis that America has with its prisons. How many? 2 million people are in prison in America, something like that. So astonishing, isn't it?
Absolutely astonishing number.
Right, let's go to another call. Let's go to Paul in Maidenhead. Hello, Paul.
Hello, gents. Big respect to both of you. And the question as well is to both of you. Do you still, both of you, believe it's a democracy when the choice is so little, like an old man struggling, holding his words and remembering anything? And then the man who is going from the court case to defend his name, is still democracy.
It's a good question, isn't it?
It's democracy, Jim, but not as we necessarily admire it. I mean, in a country of, never mind 2 million people in jail, in a country of 300 million people, Paul is absolutely right. This election has come down to a choice that millions of Americans would much rather not be having to make. And I think that the fact that we have these two elderly gentlemen engaged in a rematch that most Americans do not want to see take place is indicative of the extent to which Donald Trump has completely captured the Republican Party in ways that even on the morning after the night before in 2020 seemed unimaginable. But it's also evidence of the degree to which Joe Biden believes he is the indispensable candidate, that he didn't slay the Trump dragon back in 2020, and he needs to finish the job this time around. I mean, there are generations of politicians younger than them on both sides of the aisle craving an opportunity to run, whose dreams have basically been frozen in aspic by both of these men. And I think there's no question that it is a worry to many Americans that they've got to make this choice in the first place, which is why turnout is going to be absolutely the magic bullet in this American election in November. The parties will be relentlessly trying to give people a reason to show up at the polls because they know that the candidates themselves are likely to be voter suppressants rather than voter exciters.
And look, it is a democracy in the sense that there is a free choice between two candidates. Now, you and Simon and I might think they're not exactly the most enthralling of candidates, and in fact shouldn't be the candidates, but they have been selected by their different parties. And I can't believe that the last time America had a proper choice was actually in 2012 between Obama and Mitt Romney. I mean, even in 2016, it was a pretty poor choice, I think, between Clinton and Trump. But that's the way things are. That it's for the American people to, if they want to challenge the system, fine. But it's always open to a third-party candidate to enter the race.
Well, and you've got a third-party candidate in the form of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I mean, he's no spring chicken either, but he has the potential to be a spoiler.
Lunatic.
Well, he is a man who has a track record of embracing conspiracy theories, particularly over COVID-19, vaccines. He also has a track record as being a committed environmentalist, so he does bring some of that support to his side of the table. The Democrats and the Republicans are both very worried about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. because it's unclear where he pulls most support from. Does he pull most support from Trump or from Biden? And so they are both working overtime. They've got staff at the White House and staff in the Trump campaign specifically focused on watching Robert F. Kennedy Jr., responding to him and trying to persuade people not to back him.
Now, I wish we had Matt Forward here, who was here this time last week, because he does the most brilliant impression of Donald Trump. And I'd like him to read out this text from James in the voice of Donald Trump. He starts it with the word liar. Liar. LBC lying again about Donald J. Trump. Americans love Trump. They really love him. And your US correspondent works for the Dems and is such a loser. That's you, Simon, he's talking about. You're a loser.
I'm a loser. Well, it's a cross that I'll have to bear. Look, I think Americans, there is no question that Americans, or a substantial number of them, are enthralled by Donald Trump. And we should be clear that he has pulled off yet again the unimaginable. The idea that he is the presidential candidate for the Republican Party in 2024 would have been absolutely laughable even in 2020. And so I think one has to respect the political ability of him constantly to recreate himself and constantly to avoid the date with oblivion that so many people often predict that he is facing. I am absolutely not a Democratic Party political operative in any way.
You've been hugely critical of Joe Biden.
And I get excoriated by people on both sides for what I say about Trump and what I say about Joe Biden. I am an outside observer. I have no skin in the game, and I don't have a vote in the United States.
Now, Gordon in Hampstead says, Nikki Haley, the other Republican candidate, dropped out. Why is Trump not reaching out to her and her supporters? Will they not all go to Biden otherwise? Well, the answer to that, actually, is provided by that previous texter. She's a loser.
Well, they're not going to go to Biden because why would, relatively solidly conservative voters choose Joe Biden over staying at home? But why is Donald Trump not reaching out to them? Well, it's for the reasons that I was talking about earlier. He believes that this next administration of his needs to be undiluted MAGA. And by reaching out to her, on the one hand, he'd unify the party around him, and he would be, I think, even more confident of victory if she was by his side. But that would be diluting the brand. And his whole approach going into November is not under any circumstances to dilute it.
And just finally, Paul texts, Biden needs to make Obama his running mate. Is that constitutionally possible, given that Obama's already served 2 terms as president?
I think it would. I don't know if it's constitutionally possible. I think it would be very difficult. I think there are lots of Democrats out there who would much rather that Joe Biden considered making Mrs. Obama his running mate. But she's now completely ruled out any prospect of a political career.
Harris, she's going to stay?
I don't think there's any option for her to be off the ticket unless Kamala Harris herself decided she no longer wants to be part of this and she wants to go off and do something else. I think at this point, they talk about the Biden-Harris administration relentlessly. That's how they define themselves. I think it would be catastrophic for Joe Biden to remove her from the ticket unless she went to him and said, you know what, for the good of the cause, I think I'll move on. But at this point, it's not clear that it would do them that much good.
Well, I'm going to have to remove you from the studio because we need that chair for someone else in a minute.
Get the crane, pull me out.
It's been a pleasure.
Cheers,
Thank
Ian.
you very much. We'll do it again maybe in a couple of months.
Absolutely.
That's Simon Marks, our US correspondent. Now, coming up in the next hour, in Simon's chair, we are going to place a man called Iain Aitchison. He's a former prison governor who later led an independent review into extremism inside prisons. He's now a senior advisor to the Counter-Extremism Project, and he's author of a new book. It's called Screwed, Britain's Prison Crisis and How to Escape It. I think this is a fantastic subject to talk about. It's a subject that politicians ought to be talking about a lot more than they are, and it's about time we had a prisons minister who stayed in the job for more than 9 months. That might actually help. Rory Stewart has endorsed the book. He's called it Pithy, Provocative, Justifiably Angry. We'll hear more from Iain Aitchison. He'll be taking your calls about prison reform too. 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. O.J. Simpson, the former American football star who was controversially cleared of murder, has died of cancer, aged 76. His ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend Ron Goldman were found stabbed to death outside her home in Los Angeles during 1994. LBC's Washington correspondent Simon Marks says the trial was a pivotal moment for the United States and the worldwide media.
As it became that cable news sensation, so all the other news channels internationally started hooking into it. And, I mean, we covered the verdict live at 6 o'clock in the evening here, 1 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern Time. I was on air. And then subsequent to doing that live broadcast, we stayed on air for hours.
Simpson was later found liable for their deaths in a civil case. The head of the warship building programme at BAE Systems is warning of a shortage of skilled workers in the UK. Sir Simon Lister says the company is currently slowing down production of 8 Type 26 frigates in Glasgow. Israel is saying it will retaliate with force if Iran attacks it. There are concerns Tehran's planning a revenge strike after its consulate in Damascus was bombed last Monday. The Middle East expert, Professor Fawaz Gerges, thinks the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu may be trying to provoke Iran.
What happened in Syria was an attack on Iran's sovereignty. It was an attack on an Iranian diplomatic mission. It killed 7 senior commanders. It humiliated Iran. Really, Netanyahu, it was a provocation.
President Biden says Israel will have the ironclad support of the United States if it is attacked. A report being published in Scotland is warning the country's young